No matter where you are in the world right now, it is officially 2014, and in honor of that, we're going to take a look back at some of 2013's biggest successes and failures in gaming. Every game on this list was important for some reason. Maybe it had an excellent story, maybe it innovated in gameplay, or maybe it was such an epic failure that it made headlines all over gaming outlets. Of course, be warned that there are some spoilers for some of the games that follow in this list, so if you haven't played them, you might want to proceed with caution, and you can check the description for all the games that I'm going to be talking about. Now let's get started.
No need to kick up a fuss.
I've heard enough of your excuses, Toad.
The first game we're going to be talking about is Aliens Colonial Marines, which is important for two reasons. Not only was it the first major high-profile release of 2013, it was also the first high-profile failure of 2013. You see, the Colonial Marines that we all know and hate had been in development since 2006. Gearbox had been working on it for 7 years. It had had numerous trailers, been talked about countless times, was hyped and hyped and hyped, and then hyped a little bit more. When it finally came out, it was easily one of the most anticipated games of recent memory. And then people got their hands on it. People hated literally everything about Colonial Marines, from its storyline, which felt borderline insulting to fans of the Aliens franchise, to its terrible visuals that weren't even as good as some of the gameplay trailers from 3 years before its release, to its clunky and boring gameplay, to some awful voice acting at times, all the way up to its multiplayer, which had some interesting ideas but some lackluster execution that kept it from being all that entertaining. But the worst part of Colonial Marines was just how disappointing it was compared to all the hype. People were genuinely excited for this game, myself included, and when they got their hands on it, it wasn't just bad, it was bad in a special way. It was bad because everyone had such high hopes for it. Everyone genuinely wanted this game to be good. It wasn't a game like Duke Nukem Forever, Gearbox's previous flop, where everyone was kind of interested but no one really expected a good game. People had high hopes for Colonial Marines. They wanted it to be good, and the final product we got just wasn't. It was insult to injury, really. A bad game that people wanted to be great. On February 26th of 2013, about a week and a half after Colonial Marines' release, we had our second major flop of the year. 2013 didn't get off to a great start, so what? The game we're talking about now is Infestation Survivor Stories, known originally as The War Z. When The War Z came out, a lot of people were admittedly excited about it. Sure, it looked awfully similar to DayZ, which had been out for years before The War Z's release. It shared a similar name to both DayZ and the movie World War Z. But still, people were willing to give it the benefit of the doubt, at least until they played it, and ended up hating everything about it. When The War Z came out, it was pretty much a failure in every way possible. Many of the most promising features that developer Hammerpoint Interactive had hyped over the course of the development process were flat out absent from the final release, with many players stating that the release build didn't feel any more full-featured than an early alpha of a game. The game was full of bugs, and the abundance of guns made the whole player interaction dynamic that was supposed to make it feel like a realistic zombie simulator completely pointless, as players would just run around and kill each other to get the highest loot. On top of that, developer Hammerpoint Interactive didn't do a very good job of managing their PR team. In fact, they pretty much drummed up most of the negative press on their own. How about in October 2012, when an executive producer from the team referred to spawn campers as faggots? I'm sure that was great for their publicity. Or how about when the game originally launched in mid-December of 2012, and the Steam page advertised numerous features that, like I said earlier, flat out weren't in the final release of the game. And even when they did edit the Steam page out, they still advertised features that weren't in the game, to the point where the game had to be pulled from Steam and didn't get re-released until mid-February of 2013. Or how about their tendency towards pay-to-play features, where they allowed players to pay money to respawn in as their character, and forced them to wait for hours before they could respawn if they weren't willing to pay. Keep in mind that this is a game that you also had to pay for when you first downloaded it. What about the accusations that developers from Hammerpoint Interactive were going to game reviewer sites such as Metacritic and spamming in fake user reviews to elevate the game's average on Metacritic with users? Or the accusation of outright banning players from playing the game who the developer thought was criticizing the project? The list goes on and on. Needless to say, it was a PR nightmare on top of a terrible game.
Hey, what's up, you guys?
Now we fast forward to March 5th, 2013, and the release of the reboot Tomb Raider by Crystal Dynamics. This game had been in development for several years, and went through a couple of delays during its development cycle before finally coming out last year, and it released to some serious critical acclaim. That's right, we've finally gotten out of the crap that started 2013, and gotten to the good that followed. Well, until we get to the next game, but you'll have to wait for that. Anyways, when Tomb Raider came out, it was praised across the board. It had excellent voice acting and writing, and characters that felt realistic. You could relate to these characters, you could understand them. Part of the praise went towards the character of Lara Croft herself, who was completely remade from the sexed-up chick somehow climbing mountains in high heels and tight shorts and giant boobies, into a realistic British female who was absolutely terrified of the situation she was in. It helped advance the story a lot, and it really helped players to connect with it. Of course, everything else about the game was great too. It was gorgeous, the level designs and puzzle layouts were nice, the gameplay was smooth, fluid, and praised for being open-ended, allowing players to make their own decisions in how they engaged in combat. It was the first good high-profile release of the year. After all, it had been preceded by Colonial Marines and the War Z, so just the fact that it was a good game certainly meant it got plenty of press. But it's not just good because of what it followed. It's still an excellent game in its own right. And what better way to follow up an excellent game than with a terrible game? If we go forward 2 weeks to March 19th of 2013, we see the release of The Walking Dead Survival Instinct, a first-person shooter game set in AMC's The Walking Dead universe. Now, there were a lot of high hopes for this game. Telltale's Walking Dead Adventure series was considered one of the best games of 2012, and The Walking Dead was everywhere. Everyone loved it. Everyone wanted to be a part of it. So the thought of a survival horror first-person shooter following beloved character Daryl Dixon, everybody wanted a piece of this game. Unfortunately, it turned out to be a disaster. The game was ugly, the zombie AI was stupid even for a bunch of brainless undead, the gameplay was slow, boring, and clunky, the level designs repetitive and bland. Everything about this game was bad, but what was really disappointing is the fact that if you dug a little beneath the surface, you could see some good ideas. The idea of being able to send out survivors that you found during your journey out to scavenge for supplies, look for new survivors, etc. at the beginning of every level was a neat idea. Too bad the execution was bland and uninteresting. So was the idea of being able to choose alternate paths to pursue your journey. You could go down back roads, you could go down the highway, and each one presented its own dangers. Some of the roads would have a higher chance of breaking down, but they would offer more chances to find supplies and survivors. Unfortunately, again, this setup was executed poorly. And that's really the story of The Walking Dead Survival Instinct, disappointingly enough. A game with a lot of decent enough ideas that was completely destroyed by Activision's harsh development schedule. They weren't given enough time, and the game just didn't turn out as good as it could have been, which is a real shame, because a first-person survival horror game in the Walking Dead universe, especially with characters like Daryl and Merle that are already established and already loved by a lot of people, it had a lot of potential. It could have been something great. Unfortunately, it wasn't. And now, if we fast forward to March 26th of 2013, we get to abandon the disappointment of The Walking Dead Survival Instinct for the excellent success that was Bioshock Infinite. When this game came out, it had a lot to live up to. The original Bioshock was considered by many to be one of the greatest games of the last console generation. And here Infinite was coming out, abandoning everything that the first game had built up. Rapture was gone, plasmids were gone, the objectivist social commentary was gone. It was a completely different game. How could it possibly be as good? Turns out it could possibly be as good by being completely different. Bioshock Infinite was an excellent game. The city of Columbia was one of the best locations in gaming. Booker, DeWitt, and Elizabeth some of the best characters, and the narrative one of the most engaging and intelligent pretty much since the original Bioshock. The storytelling in particular has received huge praise over the last year for allowing players to make countless different interpretations of what everything means. See, the game deals with a lot of different themes throughout its narrative. Booker DeWitt's self-loathing, for instance, or the concept of the many worlds theory. What about the narrative's strong commentary on early 1900s racism and nationalism? All these themes tied together into one central story that left the internet buzzing for months after the game's release, trying to figure out what the game was all about, what it was trying to say. Few games can really claim something like that, and it certainly made Bioshock Infinite special among the countless other first-person shooters that came out last year. 2 months later, on May 14th, we get another excellent first-person shooter, this time in the form of Metro Last Light, the sequel to the cult hit Metro 2033. Much like Bioshock Infinite, Last Light was different from a lot of last year's first-person shooters, but not for the same reasons. Sure, it told a pretty interesting narrative, but Last Light was really different from a gameplay perspective. See, the whole point of the Metro franchise is that it's extremely realistic in its depiction of a post-apocalyptic environment. Ammo is very rare. You have to constantly swap out air filters to go to the surface, lest ye breathe in radiation and die. And you're not exactly on the top of the food chain. In fact, almost everything else can kill you a lot easier than you can kill it. Metro Last Light released to critical acclaim in large part because of these elements. It was different and it felt fresh. Of course, they took the criticisms of 2033 to heart and made the game a little more casual-friendly, but it still wasn't easy by any means. And it certainly didn't become a Call of Duty-style arcade shooter. Metro Last Light was also praised for its atmosphere. The tunnels were dark, the monsters creepy, and the surface environment destroyed, ruined, and imposing. The game created one of the best atmospheres and senses of dread of any game last year, and that was a big part of its acclaim. Last Light definitely proved that the apocalypse didn't have to be all zombies to be terrifying and entertaining. Just in case Metro Last Light wasn't enough to satisfy your inner apocalypse lover, a month later we got The Last of Us, a PlayStation 3 exclusive widely considered to be one of the best games of the last generation. And that admiration shows, as the game currently rests as the second best-reviewed game of 2013 with a Metacritic average of 95. Not too shabby for a console exclusive. Now, what made The Last of Us so special to so many people? Most people have praised it primarily for its story, especially the characters of Joel and Ellie and their interaction. An editor for IGN, who in his review gave the game a perfect 10, can be quoted as saying the interplay between Joel and Ellie, as well as other characters you meet on your adventure, is one of the great highlights in The Last of Us, while an editor from Game Informer said that the story was a high mark for interactive storytelling, due in part to one of the most poignant, well-drawn relationships I've seen in video games. Big words, but they weren't alone in that sentiment. Almost every review in any gaming publication cited those two as easily being the biggest strong suit of The Last of Us, with both of them being considered to be some of the best characters in any game from last year. Of course, the gameplay in The Last of Us also received praise, though not nearly as much as the narrative and characters. In fact, really, the only part of The Last of Us that people didn't love was the multiplayer. But who bought The Last of Us for multiplayer? Absolutely no one. Unfortunately, 2013's streak of excellent games couldn't continue, and on June 24th, 2013, we got a game that was easily the worst of 2013. Yes, worse than Survival Instinct and Colonial Marines. What game am I talking about? A little disaster piece called Ride to Hell Retribution. Developed by Eurotechnics and released by publisher Deep Silver, this game holds a Metacritic average of 19 on Xbox 360, 16 on PC, and 13 on PlayStation 3. Ouch. The game is considered by many to be quite possibly one of the worst games of all time. So bad that Electronic Gaming Monthly gave the game a score of a 0.5 out of 10. The game didn't even get a 1 here, people. What was wrong with the game? Besides the fact that it was ugly, repetitive, boring, and glitchy, it was criticized of being downright offensive to women in many ways, portraying them as absolutely nothing more than a resource in the game, with other reviewers such as PlayStation Magazine considering the game to be, quote, obnoxiously misogynistic. But beyond the political context of stuff like that, the game was just flat out broken. An editor for Game Informer said, quote, with the exception of some Kinect and Wii games that flat out don't work, this is the worst video game I've ever played this console generation. Horrible visuals, broken gameplay, game-breaking bugs, everything about the game was terrible. And when you get a chance, go and listen to the voice acting on YouTube. It's good for a laugh every now and then. Ride to Hell Retribution is so bad that developer Eurotechnics' own website does not list the game on product or news pages. The developer themselves were so embarrassed of this game that they refused to list it on their own website. Okay, when that happens to your game, you know you've done something wrong. And now we get to give our indie games a little bit of love. Fast forward a month and a half from Ride to Hell up to August 8th, and we have Papers, Please. Papers, Please is a 2D, 8-bit independent game that centers around the player playing as an immigrations checkpoint officer for the fictional country of Arstotzka. The player's job is simple. They're to go through immigrants' paperwork to see if they are eligible to enter the country. From then on, the player receives money for every immigrant they successfully integrate into the country, as well as various bribes that immigrants can present the player with. The player then takes their money and budgets it out on basic necessities such as food, water, heat, etc. It's a very simple premise, but things progressively get more and more complicated. You see, tensions between your country of Arstotzka and neighboring countries quickly rise thanks to multiple terrorist attacks in the area, and things get more and more difficult as you are expected to deny citizens of certain countries, demand more extensive searches, etc. The player is presented with some difficult choices in determining who gets to enter and who gets to stay. Like one scenario where a woman will come in claiming to be someone's husband despite having improper identification. Her papers are incomplete, and there's always the risk that she's a terrorist, but she seems pretty honest. She seems to be telling the truth when she says she is this guy's husband. Choices like that are what really had people engaged in Papers, Please, and it's why the game received such high praise. Many people were impressed that the game could immerse a player so much despite having rudimentary 8-bit graphics, and ultimately Papers, Please is considered to be one of the better games from last year. Now this next game I never actually got to play, but always wanted to, so for the sake of avoiding spoiling this game for me as much as you guys, this one's going to avoid mentioning the story much. But the next game that we're talking about is Gone Home, which released on August the 15th of last year, to, as you may have expected, critical acclaim. Now, like I said, I'm not really going to go into the story, but needless to say, given that that's really all this game has, that's why everyone loved it. See, Gone Home wasn't a normal game. It had almost no gameplay, at least not in the traditional sense. The entirety of the game was built up around exploring this one house. Basically, the entire game was environmental storytelling. Remember the audio logs that people thought were so cool in Bioshock? Well, imagine a game kind of built entirely around that concept, except actually executed well. Critics and players both loved Gone Home, praising it for its writing, its atmosphere, and its storytelling, claiming that the game manages to tell a better story in 90 minutes using nothing but environmental hints and clues than most games can tell in 7 hours with fully voiced cutscenes, which is a pretty big accomplishment. And now we follow up a small indie game with a huge AAA blockbuster, Splinter Cell Blacklist, released on August 20th of 2013. Splinter Cell Blacklist was big for a lot of reasons. For starters, the game looked gorgeous, it managed to tell a surprisingly interesting story, and it brought back the Spies vs. Mercs multiplayer mode that everybody loved that was conspicuously absent in Splinter Cell Conviction. Of course, it was also the game that got rid of Michael Ironside, but the guy they got to replace him did an okay job. People loved Splinter Cell Blacklist because its gameplay was so open. You had huge amounts of options in the massive stages. You could climb on everything, go through everything, sneak through everything, kill everyone you wanted if you wanted to, sneak past and not kill anyone if you wanted to. It was a return to the much more stealth-oriented gameplay of previous Splinter Cells, as opposed to the more straight-up shoot everything that moves, kill everybody, take no prisoners kind of attitude that Conviction had. Basically, it was a more polished third-person Dishonored, or, an older Splinter Cell game. It received positive reception from critics and players alike, holding a Metacritic average of 83%. Splinter Cell Blacklist was a huge release last year. In fact, scouring the internet earlier today for research, I found a lot of message boards where some fans even said that Blacklist might be their favorite game in the series. I don't know, I've never played a lot of Splinter Cell, but it's a good game and it was an extremely big game last year. Granted, I sucked at it and barely played it, but it was still big. And now we skip forward a month to September 17th, and arguably the most high-profile game release of last year, Rockstar Games' Grand Theft Auto V, the game that currently holds Metacritic's spot for the highest-rated game of 2013. I said currently like that could ever change. It can't. Grand Theft Auto V was probably the most anticipated game of 2013. Actually, definitely the most anticipated game of 2013. But unlike Colonial Marines, when it released, it delivered in a big way. The most obvious feature is its new gameplay mechanic of allowing the player to swap back and forth between 3 characters whenever they want. The game would alert players when certain characters were in trouble or when they had a strategic position that would help the player to complete a mission, and it certainly helped add some variety to the gameplay. It allowed you to tackle things how you wanted, allowed you to see things through the eyes of 3 different characters, and gave the player 3 different unique personalities to play around with. Which brings us to the other strength of the game, the writing and characters. Grand Theft Auto has always been known for its writing, and 5 was no exception, featuring some obvious satire and parody of pretty much the entirety of American culture nowadays, something that Grand Theft Auto is still pretty exclusive in. Of course, the huge open world full of stuff to do always helps, and the game has an entire internet within it. An entire internet. How many other games have an entire internet to screw around in? What about dozens of different virtual TV shows to watch on your virtual TV? Or how about a licensed soundtrack that consists of 241 different songs? That's why Grand Theft Auto V is such an important game. It has quite possibly the most content of any video game ever released. And it was pretty good, too. Now we fast forward ahead another month to October 11th and Telltale Games' first release in almost a year, Episode 1 of The Wolf Among Us. Now some of you might say it doesn't really count because it's just the first episode in what's going to be an ongoing series, but if you played The Wolf Among Us, you'll agree that it deserves a spot on this list. It basically took everything that Telltale did excellently with The Walking Dead back in 2012, fixes what it didn't do well, and leaves what it did great absolutely alone, making for one of the best adventure games, quite frankly, ever. It does what a pilot episode to a series needs to do, which is establish all of the characters and provide an interesting backdrop for the rest of the series. But it also does more than that, providing extremely compelling writing and interactions with the other characters. Everything that was great about how The Walking Dead handled conversation and character development carries over to this, and the writing is just as strong as it was in The Walking Dead, if not at times a little better. Granted, The Wolf Among Us still isn't all that exciting from a gameplay perspective, but it's definitely one of the best narrative experiences of last year. Our next game is a PC exclusive and another indie game, the Stanley Parable, which released on October 17th of 2013, though it originally came out in summer of 2011 as a Source Engine mod, but it saw a re-release last year, and that's the version most people have played. The Stanley Parable received a lot of praise for its narrative, mostly with how it deals with choice. The player's adventure is constantly being narrated, and these narrations change depending on the player's choice. The narrator will urge you down one specific path, but the player has the option to completely disobey the narrator if they want, forcing him to make corrections to his story and oftentimes get extremely irritated with the player for disobeying his choices. In fact, the concept of choice actually originated out of the developer's desire to make a game that played with the concept of narrative in video games, seeing how most video games at the time followed extremely linear narration styles, plus the advent of games like Braid, Portal, and Bioshock that already started to play with this idea a little bit. The Stanley Parable is unlike any other game out there. It's pretty short, but that was intentional to allow the player to experience most or all of the endings without getting an ending that feels like a total disappointment after spending 6 or 7 hours on an experience. It's a game unlike any other out there and definitely worth your time. Now we jump ahead to October 29th, a day which gave us 2 huge games last year. The first of which we're going to talk about is Battlefield 4. Battlefield 4 was being marketed much like Battlefield 3 as a Call of Duty killer, and when it released, the multiplayer anyways was certainly able to boast that. It had some of the best multiplayer the franchise had seen in a long time, being thought of as a sort of greatest hits collection for Battlefield's multiplayer. All the features that people had loved from past games, including the long-absent Commander mode, which we last saw in my personal favorite, Battlefield 2142, which finally made its return in Battlefield 4. It was the first game to be able to feature full 64-player support since Battlefield 2142 as well. In addition, the Levolution destruction features were being advertised as game changers, and though some are certainly bigger on some maps than on others, they're still welcome additions and they add some variety to the maps. Unfortunately, the multiplayer wasn't just notable for its additions, as it was also notable for being downright unplayable for some people, with server crashes, ridiculous wait times, and some maps that would just flat out crash the game. These bugs were especially apparent on PC and next-gen consoles, but also plagued the 360 and PlayStation 3 versions for quite a while. In fact, it was probably EA's rockiest launch since SimCity, which wasn't a good thing. Granted, those that managed to get into Battlefield 4's multiplayer were able to experience how fun it was, but unfortunately, a lot of people just weren't able to get that. Of course, Battlefield 4 was still a great game, but the bugs certainly hampered it, and unfortunately are actually part of why it was so noteworthy last year.
Damn.
The second major game to come out on October 29th was Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, which, despite the 4 in its title, was actually the 6th game in the franchise, which has been annual since its inception. Assassin's Creed 4 received high praise from critics. It holds an average of about 87 out of 100 across most of the platforms on Metacritic right now. Most people praised it for the depth of its naval combat, its excellent graphics, huge amount of side quests, and wide-open gameplay, with the reviewer for Edge declaring that Black Flag, quote, sets a new benchmark not only for Ubisoft's series, but for open-world gaming. Granted, all wasn't well with Assassin's Creed 4, as many people gave the main story missions a mixed reception, with some saying that they were easily the weakest part of Black Flag. There were also some complaints against the overall story in general, with some people complaining that the second half was far less interesting than the first half. Overall, though, most people considered the game to be a huge step forward for the franchise, and it certainly released a lot less buggy than Assassin's Creed 3 did, which is always a good thing. Next up, we have easily the most high-profile release of last year, and definitely the one that was guaranteed to sell the most copies. Call of Duty Ghosts, which released on November 5th of 2013 for pretty much every platform out there. Now, Ghosts is kind of special in the Call of Duty series for receiving the worst average critical reception of any game since Call of Duty 3. Which I find weird, because Ghosts is actually my personal favorite since the original Black Ops came out. But that's really not the point of this video. The point of this video is to talk about the games. Ghosts tried to do a lot of things different. Extinction mode is basically zombies to a lot of people, but it actually plays surprisingly different. Meanwhile, the multiplayer revamped customization a lot, has a somewhat different class setup system, and features much more wide-open maps than the franchise normally has. The squad modes basically takes the overall concept of combat training, pitting players against bots, but expands on it, allowing players to literally set up their own squad and send them off against other players' squads to compete for experience, which I think is a pretty clever idea. Granted, the campaign doesn't do nearly as much to change up the series as the multiplayer does, but it's still dumb fun. What do you expect from a Call of Duty game? Personally, I don't think Ghosts deserved the negative press that it got. Or not negative, but less than positive than most of the rest of the series has gotten. I think it's a good game. But regardless of what you thought of the game itself, there's no denying that it was huge last year. Every Call of Duty game is. And now we've come to the last game on our list, which released on November 22nd of 2013. Super Mario 3D World, ironically enough, the only Nintendo exclusive on this list. What was so special about Super Mario 3D World? Besides getting one of the highest average review scores of last year, with an average on Metacritic of 94 out of 100, as well as being the highest scored Wii U game to date, it also happens to hold the best multiplayer of any Nintendo title, which is really its biggest draw. It evolves upon the multiplayer that Nintendo has steadily been building up with games like New Super Mario World, into something that players can really get together and play. The new costumes and levels are great and all, and the game's also received very high praise for its level design being cited as some of the best in the series. But what's really made it so popular is the fact that its multiplayer is the most fun the series has had. It allows 4 players to get together and completely screw with each other in any way that they want to, giving them more or less endless possibilities within the levels to work together or totally screw each other over and be giant douchebags in the Mushroom Kingdom. And people like that. It takes everything they liked about New Super Mario Wii's multiplayer, gives it 4 players, makes it 3D, and says, have fun. And people loved it for it. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, the 18 best and worst games of 2013. Let me know what you thought of the video. If there's anything that you think I left off the list that should have been on here, whether it deserved to be on here for good or bad reasons, let me know in the comments down below. Be sure to leave a like, share if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you really enjoyed it. And as always, I'm Alanman98. Thanks for watching.